Good morning again, and thanks so much for joining Southface Institute's Sustainability and Action Roundtable, or SART, as we call it over here, focused on environmental justice and racial equity. I'm Catherine, your host today. We are so glad you've joined us. We have a few updates and reminders for you before we dive in. Let us know you're here by saying hello in the chat box. Like I said, add your name and affiliation if you'd like. Also, feel free to share any upcoming events or job listings that relate to the sustainability field. Southface is hiring several positions ourselves. We'll post a link in the chat box as well. You can use hashtag SouthfaceSART on social media to connect with other SART attendees and share links to other upcoming sustainability events. Feel free to ask questions for our panelists at any time using the chat box. Your questions will be passed on to our moderator for the Q&A session later in the event. Did you attend a SART in 2020 or 2021 and need continuing education credits from the American Institute of Architects? Email events@southface.org with your name, AIA number, and which SARTs you have attended. Oops, I guess I skipped a slide. Sorry. All right, so Southface is a member-supported environmental and community development nonprofit. Becoming a Southface member is a great way to connect with other sustainability professionals and receive discounts on courses, events, and continuing education units. And when you become a member, you help us fulfill our mission of building a low-carbon regenerative economy that embodies responsible resource use, social equity, and healthy built environment for all. If you would like to become a member, feel free to reach out to me in the chat box with the hashtag member and hit send. You can send it directly to me, or you can send it to the whole group. Either works. And when you do that, I will be giving you a $25 Macy's gift card as well. So go ahead and sign up today. As we move into the event, make sure to mute yourself. You can stay on camera if you want, but we'll mainly have our panelists be on camera today, but make sure to mute yourself or we will mute you ourselves. So now I'll hand it over to Andra Pinabell, Southface Institute's president and the moderator of our event today. Welcome, Andrea.
Thank you, Catherine, and hello everybody, and welcome to our July SART. Today's discussion will focus on answering one of the most important questions anyone who works in sustainability is challenged with. How do we embed environmental justice and racial equity into the regenerative economic model? As we all know, the linear economic model of take, make, dispose has created countless environmental crises. When we extract resources from the earth that eventually return to waste, decisions must be made on how that waste is handled and where it goes. Just gonna pause here for a second. Can you guys see me? It says my camera is on. Okay, all right, great. So when we take and extract these resources from the earth that eventually then return to waste, we do need to decide how that waste is handled and where it goes. As we know from countless studies, communities of color at all socioeconomic levels and communities with fewer financial resources are disproportionately chosen to carry this environmental brunt to the detriment of their health and well-being, not only for this generation, but for generations to come. These same communities are often excluded from opportunities to take advantage of sustainable building programs and resources that would improve not only their environment, but also provide for a sustainable community. If we can shift our approach, really make that transformational shift from a linear economic model to one that is regenerative, we can intentionally embed inclusivity and equitable practices into our systems and combat some of these entrenched inequities for future. And not only for the communities today to thrive, but communities of the future, and really get to that notion where everyone can thrive. Here at Southface, we have really done a lot of work to get us to a point from over 40 years of setting up real world examples of advancing social equity through the regenerative economics and trying to impact not only communities that are local, but communities across the country. Our healthy housing work not only helps to improve the quality of life and health of residents, but also helps to improve the energy efficiency and reduce energy burden for residents with low to moderate incomes while lowering their carbon and waste footprint. Our Good Use program seeks to build the capacity of nonprofit organizations like Boys and Girls Clubs and food banks through technical assistance, water and energy efficiency programs so that they can reinvest those savings into their core programs and further serve the community. Through our policy work, we're advocating for clean energy investment that prioritizes access to resources and opportunities for Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, as well as those in lower income communities. And we're increasing the scope and effectiveness of climate resilient efforts at both the state and local level, while trying to prioritize communities at greatest risks from climate impacts. I'm so proud of the work that we do here at Southface and how it is advancing environmental justice and racial equity. But we are far from being the only organization to drive progress through sustainability work. And we cannot do it alone. Partnerships are key, grassroots organizations are key, philanthropic and commercial and private sector is also key, in addition to governments. It really is going to take all of us together to lift up these communities. That's why I'm so excited about this discussion here today. We have an amazing and outstanding set of panelists here to share their insights that they have gained not only through their work, but also through the work of their partnerships, so that we can all learn from each other on how to best achieve our shared vision of an equitable future. So let's get started with a first round of introductions. So first up is Chandra Farley with Partnership for Southern Equity. Chandra?
Thanks so much, Andrea, and thanks so much to Southface for inviting me. I feel like I'm back at home. I am the Just Energy Director at the Partnership for Southern Equity, where I lead our energy equity and climate justice work. And I'm looking forward to this conversation. I always say to folks that Partnership for Southern Equity's logo is a circle for a reason. Our other issue areas are all embedded in our energy equity work. How do we talk about equitable development? How do we talk about health equity? And how we talk about access and opportunity through the economy. So looking forward to diving into the conversation today.
Thanks so much, Chandra. Next up is Frank Fernandez, who's the CEO of the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta. Frank?
Good afternoon, everyone. I guess good morning still. Happy Friday. Frank Fernandez, been here at the Community Foundation for now 11 months. And really for today's conversation, really thinking about the nexus of environmental resilience and sustainability and equity. And equity is a very strong focus for us, and for us and how we think about that at its core, it's really about how do we help ensure that residents of our region have a fair shot at a decent life, and really looking at the intersections and the interplay or all these different issues around race, gender, geography, climate, how they affect that and how they interact with one another, and how we as funders can help in a positive way put our finger on the scale to move these issues in a good and more equitable direction. So excited to be here. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And our third panelist, Danielle Baird, who's the CEO of BlocPower. I know he was going to be a couple of minutes late, and I don't believe he's joined yet, but I know that he is planning on being here. I think he's just running a couple minutes late. Donnel, just making sure that you're not on yet. Okay. If I could just have one of my team members, when Donnel does join, just to ping me so I can make sure that he gets the introduction. So first up, Frank and Chandra, we will start with you. Environmental racism continues to be widespread across the United States, with Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities exposed to climate risks and environmental injustices at a higher rate than Caucasian communities. What key challenges do you think we need to address in how we approach environmental justice and its impact on these marginalized communities? And Frank, we'll start with you.
So I'll start by focusing on my most recent experience on this issue. So some of you may know, before coming to the Community Foundation, I was with the Blank Foundation and helped lead its place-based efforts on the West Side. And this issue of environmental racism and the environmentally unjust, basically geographies and systems that were in place were very, very stark and apparent. And in fact, it was last week, Cook Park just opened, which I think it was the beginning of a solution, or a beginning to help address some of these long-term and long-standing challenges. And so to me, in terms of how we think about what are the things we need to do, part of it is just having a really good, deep understanding of what the issues are and how they play out specifically, whether it's or water and wastewater, but really looking at basic infrastructure and the role infrastructure plays around these issues. And infrastructure is not just like parks and water and wastewater, but also things like our land use regulations and how they either can further environmental justice or not, and how we try to incent that. And so to me, looking at some of those core things is a starting point, right? So I'll just use the example I started with, where for those who are familiar, water and wastewater systems we have in Atlanta, for example, are been set up in such a way, and sometimes these were intentional, sometimes it's unintentional or subconscious, to really drive a lot of flooding and mixing of our water and wastewater into communities on the West Side, which historically have been African American or Black. And that is something that a lot of folks knew, but hadn't really addressed. And as the infrastructure got built out, it became more and more apparent, and also more and more expensive to address it. But we reached a point where we can't no longer do that, and we need to address it. And I think Cook Park, in terms of being able to hold up to 10 million gallons of water to help to ensure that the combined over sewer flow doesn't happen when you have significant flooding events, is a good starting point in helping to address that. Now, the kicker with that, I think, is that one of the things I have seen in my career and just doing community development for a long time is that it's almost this infrastructure dilemma, where the very investments in infrastructure that are a function of redlining that's occurred and need to occur to address these issues over a long term are the very things that can often displace people, right? So when you think about this investment, just use Cook Park and the West Side Park and these things that I think are helpful in lots of ways from an environmental sustainability perspective and other, are good things. However, by themselves, they actually could be accelerants to gentrification or displacement. And so to me, this is why kind of looking why we're focused and thinking about the intersectionality of these issues is so important, because you can't just address environmental resilience issues by itself, because it has these negative externalities like potentially displacing people because you make this a more desirable place to live and prices go up. And so to me, looking at the investments in infrastructure as well as how these things intersect with other things, especially around housing and concerns around gentrification, are really critical.
Chandra, anything to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I think that we have to confront the intentionalities. If we are talking about equity, if we are talking about justice, we are talking about the opportunity to talk about why things are the way they are. So we address them at the root cause. I think many of us have participated in meetings and forums where we talk about community agreements and recognizing the impact, even if that wasn't your intent. And when we are talking about infrastructure, when we are talking about economy, when we are talking about land use, when we are talking about health, we can trace all that back to a legacy of white supremacy and structural racism. We can look at redlining and why various areas are more impacted by urban heat island. We can look at redlining and we can look at where our energy burdened communities are. So a justice frame, an environmental justice frame, climate justice, racial, it's all justice, right? I think we can start with that. And particularly equity, as we talk so much about at Partnership for Southern Equity, is making sure that it is about the way of doing things, not just the what of doing things. So I think that's first, independent of what the issue is. You know, we've got to talk about geography and why those things are the way they are, which is critical. Race, income, and zip code. You know, it's critical to understanding why these things are the way they are, which sets us up to then propose and pursue truly just and equitable solutions, because we're starting from the root cause of the issue in the first place. And totally agree with Frank around we've got to redefine what infrastructure really means. We cannot miss this critical moment to redefine infrastructure as care, to redefine infrastructure as environmental justice, to redefine climate investment as traditional now infrastructure. So those are the things that just I would like to layer on as we continue in the conversation.
Thanks so much, Chandra. And I would also engage that another part of infrastructure that is really important is transportation, because we know that jobs is not just, it's not about just about income, but it's also about transportation to get to those jobs and where economic development investment happens and where the transportation infrastructure also goes, so we can make sure people can get to those jobs within those economic centers. And I know Donnel is here, and so I'm going to let him introduce himself. And then Donnel, if you want to just answer the question that we are contemplating now, which is environmental racism continues to be widespread in the United States, with Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities being exposed to climate risk and environmental injustices at higher rates than Caucasian communities. What key challenges do you think we need to address, and how we approach environmental justice and its impact on these marginalized communities? So,
first of all, let me say, I grew up in Atlanta, and I thought that you were going to come in with a softball question to open this up. we just jumped right into the ugliest parts of. All right, so I'm Donnel. I am the CEO of a climate tech startup. I'm a huge fan of Chandra and Andrea and Frank. Looking forward to hearing your comments and meeting you through this forum. My mom lives in Stone Mountain, Georgia, where I grew up, and I went to high school in Buckhead public schools and private schools. And just always delighted to connect with this group. So my company finances and analyzes building electrification. We want to move buildings 100% off of fossil fuels. We want to turn the buildings into Teslas by ripping out the fossil fuel gas heating, gas cooling, gas air conditioning, hot water heating. We want to rip all that stuff out, replace it with smart, modern, 100% renewable, 100% electric equipment that is healthier, greener, smarter. It makes the buildings more valuable. It makes the neighborhood healthier because there's not, fossil fuel pollution spewing out of every building, giving all the kids asthma. So that's what we do. We work with cities and utilities to analyze and finance which buildings in low-income communities are great candidates for these projects, and we train and develop a workforce to install these systems wherever we can. We also work in churches, houses of worship, synagogues, mosques, schools, community buildings. So I don't know if I ran out the clock enough to avoid your question, but I think that
you're good.
I think that in communities that need environmental justice and in communities that need economic justice, there is a shared opportunity to invest in smart green infrastructure. Now, that can be giant infrastructure projects like roads and bridges, or distributed infrastructure like the smart heating and cooling systems that we put into buildings, or rooftop internet systems that will close the digital divide, whether it's in West Virginia or Southwest Atlanta, where I grew up. And the opportunity to get jobs installing that infrastructure, but also to own that infrastructure, is a way of dealing with historic inequalities and racism in this country and unequal access to economic opportunity. So I believe, and my company is organized around the allocation of literal shares of stock. So when we talk about equity, we're not just talking about justice, we're talking about equity like you trade public stocks and equities and bonds of a security, where low-income heads of household would receive a share of stock in a green infrastructure project in South Atlanta. And so if we're gonna put a giant solar virtual power plant on a bunch of roofs in South Atlanta and Vine City, low-income heads of households should own 10-15% of that project. As those solar panels generate revenue from Georgia Power and other folks for peak demand response and smart grid integration, there should be dividends that are paid out to those heads of households. And so that's the opportunity I see to think differently about how to use green infrastructure as a whole, whether it's large and centralized or small and modular and decentralized. How do we use that as a wealth generation opportunity, as well as a job creation opportunity for communities in need of justice?
Well said. You know, it's interesting. You and I talked a lot about economic mobility, in addition to, you know, as you said, job creation, minimizing that or eliminating the digital divide. And Donnel, let's stick with you for the next question. Data and technology are as you describe BlocPower, you are a software company, you know, green climate software company. How do you use data and technology to help address the equity and environmental justice issues that you just laid out? And how can, you know, your for-profit green tech model be replicated and scaled to retrofit and to make a difference across the built environment on a much larger scale?
I think that as a progressive, you know, I don't love that everything that Uber, for example, has done, or how Google or Facebook approach growing and scaling and profitability. I don't think they pay their workers enough. I hate that they're capturing our data and selling it to Russia and who the hell ever else. Like, I don't like all of that stuff. I do think that there's lessons that we need to learn from Silicon Valley about how to grow clean energy solutions. How do you build a company that grows as fast and as powerful and as large as a Facebook or an Uber or a Google, and have that company dedicated to the proposition of low-income families across America owning wealth that's being created by green energy assets in their local community? And so let's break that apart. You can look at everything from data privacy to cryptocurrency to employment models and ownership models of early employees at startups. These are three areas where I learn a ton from Silicon Valley. But let me start simple. There is a hardware innovation that is a silver bullet to reducing greenhouse gas emissions across America in the building sector, which is the cold climate heat pump. terrible name, but what it is it's an all-electric heating, cooling, and hot water system that's emerged out of Japan. And just like the iPhone revolutionized computing, where now everybody in America can afford to have a $50 supercomputer in their pocket and connect to the internet everywhere they go, and that's revolutionized media, transportation. Just as revolutionary is this cold climate heat pump and the ability for us to power buildings all electric and have them connected to the internet. So we have a hardware breakthrough that's as powerful as the smartphone. So that's one. What are we going to do with that? Are we going to collect everybody's data and sell it to Russia like Facebook? No. What we're going to do is take lessons from cryptocurrency and financial technology to think about how do we build a software layer on top of that hardware, all of that equipment that we're going to be installing in buildings to make them all electric. What is the software layer? What is the Google of all of the data that's produced by all of that equipment? And who owns that Google? Who owns that software? What is the Comcast? I don't remember what the cable company is down in Georgia. AT&T. What is the AT&T of this new computing platform in buildings that will launch the internet of buildings across America, which of course will extend into low-income buildings as well as affluent buildings. So because we have this breakthrough piece of equipment, we now have the ability to build all kinds of new software like a Google for buildings or an internet or DirecTV for buildings, an internet of buildings on top of this equipment and this computational infrastructure. What are the purposes of those companies and of that software? Who will own that data? How do we monetize it? And my argument is as we build that software layer on top of all of these new smart devices that we're installing to green our homes, my argument is that these new internet companies should be owned and operated. The buildings of internet in America should be owned by low-income people in America because it's our homes that these software systems are going to be built on top of. And so we want to own a piece of that. And of course, if we own it, we're going to control some of the jobs, but we're also going to control some of the policies to make sure that there's great corporate governance and so that we don't make the same mistakes that Silicon Valley continues to make. So that's my argument, Andrea. Does that make sense?
That absolutely makes sense. And I think that the ability to share that wealth and to have accountability of ownership of that data, because we know data is power. The one thing that I would add is that building technology, like car technology, has evolved significantly, but the training of the people to manage the operations and maintenance of those buildings has not. And we're seeing significant gaps in how people actually operate building management systems, technologies like building automation systems, and how to actually operate those buildings in an efficient way. And so I think there's opportunity as we utilize these new hardware systems and these new software systems to create upward mobility in the sustainable operation and maintenance of those buildings over the long term. Any comment, Chandra or Frank, with to Donnell's answer? If not, we'll move on to the next question.
Well, I can say, particularly in talking about building operations, and this is something we learned in expanding grants to green and talking about economy and making sure we talk about Black people, we talk about communities of color, but we are also talking about our rural communities. And what we found, following the engineers out, into these rural communities, they just did not even have any experience or exposure to the technologies that we were talking about. Things that were very quote unquote low hanging fruit to us, they just didn't have investment driving it, had no reason, to ever think about any of these technologies. And so what we ended up unintentionally doing is it was almost like this technology mentorship, right? We had some of our big companies, big LED folks coming in and agreeing to work with some of these building owners who, quite frankly, these facility managers are also like the program manager, at these clubs and these buildings and nonprofits. So I wanted to bring that up because when we're talking about regenerative economy and we're talking about embedding justice and equity into that, looking at that full spectrum of not just the full spectrum of energy planning and decision making, but what it really means to grow a regenerative economy and all of the full cycle of people, the full cycle of components that we are talking to need to be driving the conversation, not just at the table, but driving the conversation, because we can't embed environmental justice. We can't embed racial equity. It has got to be the thing that everything else radiates out from that. I think what we see, the reasons that we still have quote unquote challenges is because we keep trying to do it the opposite way. And we know equity is a systematic approach for accounting in differences and opportunities. So which is supposed to drive systems transformation. So I think that we always have to get back to that when we're talking about equity and we're talking about justice. We are talking about systems transformation and then attacking the system from the people who need to know exactly what we're talking about and why it's important. So that's why organizing and mobilizing first and most impacted communities is so important, all the way to the board members of electric membership cooperatives or those building owners and managers that we are talking about either outside of the city core or just who haven't had the opportunity to even take advantage of the kinds of technologies that we are talking about.
Thank you, Chandra. Frank?
The only thing I would add is it's really a broader piggyback on Donnell's earlier comment in terms of how do we help underserved communities and specifically Black and Latinx communities access the green economy. It's really the same challenge running, whether it's green economy type of jobs or opportunities or tech or what have you. It's what are the barriers that are there? And I would be very specific from a workforce development perspective as well as a business entrepreneurship perspective, and really think through how do we reduce those barriers, right? So you think about green jobs, which we've been talking about for now 15 plus years, right? What are the barriers for folks from lower income communities, for example, to get trained appropriately and get the right certifications and connected to those employers who are doing that and create pathways. So addressing those barriers, right? So to me, that's a key part of this and thinking through systematically how we do that. And then on the other side of it, in terms of how we help access folks, the big barriers tend to be access to capital for whether you're a Black-owned business or women-owned business who's trying to develop a green economy type of startup. What are the things that we can do to help that? So from the foundation perspective, those are the things we want to focus on is how do we work with groups and nonprofits and the business community to address those barriers, to reduce that so that folks can really access these opportunities that are there.
Yep. Thank you, Frank. And next question, actually, we'll stick with you, Frank. We've been talking a lot around infrastructure already, both the built infrastructure as well as the softer side of infrastructure, as well as the existing building market. What does your work at the Community Foundation, also your prior work at the Blank Family Foundation, teaches about building resilient communities? So how can we help foster climate smart development without that displacement, without those displacement issues that we've seen on the west side and across Atlanta?
I think the first thing is really planning for success. So assuming when you're doing a revitalization effort or just thinking about what happens across our region, really is assuming that things will go well and then planning accordingly. And when I say that, to me, it's a real-time thing that we're focused on in terms of as we move forward, we want to do deeper and targeted place-based work across the region. And one of the things I know from being here in Atlanta, as well as being my prior experience, is that if you invest in a good, thoughtful, deliberate, and coordinated way, that will build momentum. And that is a good thing. However, it can also be a bad thing if you don't think through how you lock in and the you being the collective you, right? What we as a group of folks who want to advance equity do, how do we make sure that we lock in long-term or properties for long-term community benefit? To me, that is a starting point, because again, a lot of these investments in, I'll go back to Cook Park, and someone asked what Cook Park was. It is basically a green infrastructure project. It is a beautiful, amazing park that just opened, but it's effectively a large green infrastructure project that's trying to address historic water quality and flooding issues in a particular community. But it also has the ability to be a huge gentrifying project as well. And so to me, to build a more resilient community, to be able to have these investments in a regenerative economy and really address environmental racism, you have to, and not do it without displacement, you got to start there from a land use perspective and say, okay, how do we lock in long-term affordability? And this is not just for residential, you have to do that on the commercial side as well, because we tend to focus appropriately on residential. But if you have and you retain affordable housing, but you're not able to help those business owners stay who are serving those folks who are legacy residents, you're only solving for half the problem. And so from my perspective, that is the big starting point from a planning perspective, is how you lock that in, because then that buys you time for all the other planning work to think through how all of these things intersect with one another, and how you build in the front end at both a residential commercial level. Like I'm now, Donnel, I need to look up this cold climate heat pump, because I hadn't heard of that before. I'm not in that space where I'm like, I need to read all about that. So how do we ensure that all that happens? So on all homes, affordable housing as well, right? Because to me, as someone who used to do green affordable housing development, it did cost us more on the front end, but the payback period was really fast if you invest in the right types of things. Especially now, it's gotten even better than when I used to do it. And so to me, that you can do that, and you can build that into the process, and you have the time to do that. But you only have that if you do the first thing, which is how do you lock in property for long-term community benefit.
Thank you, Frank. Chandra, next one is to you. And you touched on this a little bit earlier in terms of starting with equity, starting with justice at the hub, and then going out from spokes from there. Tell us a little bit about Partnership for Southern Equity's Just Energy Circle, and how is energy an equity issue? And I know that you have been working very hard on this grassroots, bottom up and top down approach to helping people understand why energy is such an equity issue.
Yeah, absolutely. So we always like to start with definition, right? So we define energy equity as the fair distribution of the benefits and burdens of electricity production and consumption. And we could look at any indicator and see that that is not the case. Energy burden, as everyone, is getting more familiar with and really is an important indicator, but that is only one indicator of the broader issue of energy insecurity, the trifecta of insecurity, as Dr. Diana Fernandez calls it: housing, power, and food. So when we look at those insecurities, we can talk of, we also, I would say the sector, we love to start with quote unquote what people we classify as low income. But when you were looking at a low income population, when you're looking at a renter population, what are the demographics of that population? Those are Black people, those are Indigenous people, those are folks who live in rural communities. So as a racial equity organization, which is also critical, when we're talking about equity, we're talking about just and fair inclusion. But our mission at Partnership for Southern Equity is to leverage racial equity as a means to advance shared prosperity. And so racial equity really refers to what a genuinely non-racist society would look like. So looking at things like energy burden, where we know we have marginalized groups, renters, paying upwards of 3 times as much of their household income towards energy bills than white, wealthier households. That's a racial equity issue. And that is an issue of electricity distribution, extraction, regulation. So all of those is how we connect energy to equity, just to super baseline. And so all the things that we are talking about, the technologies, we've got to have people who know what they are, so they are positioned to demand that they want them. Power concedes nothing without demand, right? And I think we can speak at that, you know, as technically as it relates to how we get electricity. But also from a justice perspective. And the more that we are able to educate people who are first and most impacted by inequities related to energy, the more that they have plenty of knowledge. We talk a lot about, or you hear a lot about, oh, we want to make energy a kitchen table issue, or oh, we want to make climate a kitchen table issue. These are kitchen table issues. People are talking about these things every day, just not in the same language we are. They know they have to keep their home at unhealthy temperatures because they're afraid of not being able to pay the bill. They know that their kids or family members have to go to the hospital more from asthma attacks than others. These are all issues of energy, and these are all issues that we can relate to environmental injustice. So coalition work like we do through the Just Energy Circle, where we're bringing together the uncommon allies. So technical folks, you know, like a Southface, the lawyers like a Southern Environmental Law Center, renewable energy companies like a Cherry Street, around the table with frontline environmental justice organizations like West Atlanta Watershed, Georgia Wand, members of our Just Energy Academy. You know, we do a community leadership program, 7-month program specifically focused on bringing community members together, not just to, you know, learn about what is racial equity? What does it mean? Why is it important? Conflict resolution and community, storytelling and narrative, and energy policy 101, energy regulation 101. So getting people activated and motivated and understanding that they do know more about these issues than they think, then moves them along to a position to be able to stand up in front of the Public Service Commission and say, I want clean energy in my community. Why isn't this energy efficiency program being offered in my community? So then they're able to, and then we move this along, because ultimately this is about building a strong civic democracy ecosystem and infrastructure, so we can demand the kind of energy democracy outcomes that Donnel was talking about.
Thanks, Chandra. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the intersection of health and energy burden, because I think that while I think for this audience, it makes a lot of sense. We have people who are choosing to not turn on air conditioners because of the energy bills, to be able to put food on the table and to buy other essentials. At the same time, when you don't do that, especially in hot, humid climate, that creates mold spores. It creates asthma triggers. And that intersectionality of the social determinants of health and energy burdens and energy efficiency are very clear, and they're very integrated. And we're seeing that more and more as a macro trend, but I just wanted to call out that I was really glad that you mentioned that. So next question is for all 3 panelists, and we will start with Donnel. As the economy rebounds from the pandemic, labor shortages are being felt across many low-paying hospitality and retail jobs. Many economists are questioning if this is a blip or if workers are actually reassessing the type of work that they want to do. Is now the time to engage a new generation of entering into the green economy?
Well, I think, you know, in our American economic system, we, you know, what workers are able to negotiate for right now is largely a function of what they can get in the free market. Labor unions across the country and across the economy have largely been decimated, other than in the healthcare sector in the Northeast and upper Midwest and in the industrial sector. And so, you get what you can negotiate for as a worker. If, I made a comment in the comments, if you're a driver for Uber, you don't get health benefits, you don't even really get a wage, you don't get employment benefits. You're an independent contractor, even though, you function as an employee. And so right now there is an opportunity in the skilled construction trades. There is a dramatic shortage of skilled construction workers across the country. And so I do believe there is a massive opportunity for historically disenfranchised communities, not only to get jobs in the industry, but to build new companies that they own. I want to see women, veterans, minority, people of color start design, build construction firms that are using software from day one to build digital models of the construction site and help to use software to enable efficient management of construction work of all kinds. So we need a new generation of construction workers and companies, period. And we do not have enough construction workers that have technical skills. And the reason for that is, if you think about it, like if you're a plumber and you make $200,000 a year and you're in the suburbs and your kid grows up and goes to college, they don't want to run your plumbing company. They want to become an influencer on TikTok. And they're not learning how to take over the plumbing company. And so when you look at the data, you'll see that millennials are not entering the skilled construction trades workforce, but there's a bunch of barriers that have historically prevented communities of color from entering this industry. We got to knock those barriers down and bring in, whether it's ex-offenders and people who are returning citizens who are ready to get back to work and build a productive life. They'd be thrilled to make $200,000 a year and take over a plumbing company. So the question for us is, there is a massive opportunity. What are the ways that other people like Southface, can train and prepare these communities to access this and take advantage of this labor shortage so that our communities can participate in solving the labor shortage problem, the lack of software in the construction industry and the inefficiency therein, as well as the broader climate change disaster that we're all in. And then in other parts of the economy, people are still, yesterday in New York City, we had flash floods. And so there's footage of, there's like 3-foot high water in the New York City subways, and people are putting on garbage bags over their sneakers and walking into the water to try to get onto the subway because they got to go to work. Like, they can't quit that job. So for different parts of the economy, workers are able to negotiate different kinds of financial compensation, but skilled construction trades and green infrastructure is absolutely an opportunity that communities of color and historically disenfranchised communities should access.
I would just add to what Donnel said. I think I completely agree. I think I have no clue whether it's a blip or a long-term shortage, but in either case, I think because green jobs are across multiple sectors, right? In tech, in construction, as he was just pointing out, in lots of different areas. And I would just go back to a point I was raising earlier, is that to me, it's always a good time, but still it's the case that we have to understand the barriers that folks have to being able to access those jobs, in terms of whether it's any training they may need, kind of just general outreach, they may not know about it, and then connection to employers and where those jobs are, because those jobs are growing. It's just, do folks know about them, and are they appropriately trained, and are employers going to be open to them, right? So, Donnel raised the idea of how we engage returning citizens in addressing some of the biases that folks may have towards that, right? I think when you have labor shortages, people are more open to reconsidering them because they have a shortage. So to me, that's one of the advantages of now, is take advantage of that to get people to rethink and address some of those things. That's something that within the construction industry, it has definitely happened here in Georgia. I have good examples of that with the stadium when it was getting built, around really educating a lot of the larger commercial construction firms to be more inclusive as it relates to working with folks who have criminal backgrounds or are returning citizens.
Yeah, I will, definitely on the barriers, everything, it's Frank was pointing out, and Donnel, just about the shifts. I think I'm not sure if blip is the right word I would use. I think transformation is more of a word. I mean, the royal we have experienced something due to COVID that most of us have never experienced before. There's lots of articles out right now about the Great Resignation, and I think people have had or have taken an opportunity to really reimagine what quote unquote work has to mean to them and what that means to them. And this goes back to our values, right? We talk about jobs, jobs, but we must be talking about generating equity, particularly through clean energy deployment. Has to be about a strategy, not only for lifting people out of poverty, but increasing equity in the distribution of income. We've got to talk about wealth building, and we've got to talk about entrepreneurship. And I think that people don't want to be exploited, right? Nobody wants a job. My mama, I'm sure all of us must have said, you don't want a job. Job is journey up the broke, right? So I think we have to redefine what we mean by job. And I think that we have to, not only do we need shifts in the industry, construction, solar, these are soft skill things that people, this is hard work, right? All of these are not high road jobs. Some of these are still low paying, just hard working, being on the ground, being on the roof jobs. But I think that we have a great opportunity because when we look at energy efficiency business, we know that the majority of them are small business owners. When we look at the opportunities around weatherization, when we look at what a redefinition of a career in tech means, as Donnel was talking about, I think we just have to seize the time to think about all of these things together and to remember that how are we going to, I don't even know if you want to say a reimagining of racial capitalism, but why, really what is holding people back? I think it's less about wages and more about a level of exploitation that people have been reminded of, that we still see in this capitalist economy. And people are just like, I just not going to do it anymore.
I agree with all of you. And I also think we also have a changing dynamic of the workforce. We have people who need to be working longer. We also, at the same time, people retired at 3 times the level this year than they have in years past. So it's a really interesting dynamic right now. And to couple on what we were talking about in terms of workforce and the different sectors that really have to be part of this conversation and part of the solution. Today, we have a nonprofit with Partnership for Southern Equity. We have philanthropy with the Community Foundation, and we have a private sector company with BlocPower. What is the role of public-private partnerships? And what is the responsibility of public-private partnerships to get us moving in the right direction? And Donnel, I'm going to start with you on this one because I know that this is really your model as well. And what have you seen that's working really well, and what's still broken in this model that we need to take a deeper dive in?
I think, what a great question. I mean, I was a community organizer. I had the good fortune to be trained by some of the people that had trained Barack Obama when he was a community organizer. And what they teach you in community organizing school is like that the way that the American system is set up is there's like 3 buckets, right? There's like the government part, there's the private sector part, and then there's the civic part, like nonprofits, your parent-teacher association, foundations, like where Frank works, like all of the work that we all do, our labor union. So like there's this like civic and citizenship organization sector of homeowners where we are with our families and our loved ones and our neighbors. And then there's the government who we all pay taxes to. And then there's the private sector that serves as corporations. And the question is like, how do you bring all of these sectors of society into a balance that kind of works? Like if you have an overemphasis on one sector over the other two, you're out of balance and things kind of run off the rails. And so, you know, one of our political parties wants to hand everything to the private sector, and then they criticize the other political party for wanting to hand everything to the government, right? And then really the way that we vote and put elected officials and policymakers in place is through our third sector, our citizenship sector. So how do you get to a balance of those three sectors? And so we think that public-private partnerships, where you have your religious community, your nonprofit community, your educational community, who, by the way, own billions of dollars of real estate. There's no way you're going to green a bunch of buildings without talking to the Catholic Church. I mean, they're the largest property owner in the city of Chicago. They're one of the top 5 property owners in the city of New York. Like, how are you going to green a bunch of buildings without talking to religious leaders? It doesn't make any sense. How can you engage that citizenship sector with incentive and subsidies and programs from the government? How do we make sure those programs are designed well, that they facilitate activity instead of slow it down? And then how do you have the private sector show up, not just to like rob and pillage everybody else and take all of our money and give it to Wall Street, but how do we show up in a productive way where productivity is measured in terms of profits, climate impact reduction, job creation, and this model that Henry Ford pioneered when he started his company, which is like, we're gonna make all these cars, but I need to make sure that all my workers who work for me can afford to buy the car that I'm paying them to produce. And what kind of models can we get into to rebalance it? I think public-private partnerships are critical, particularly in a 50-50 Senate where the Republicans and the Democrats have to negotiate everything and everything's kind of split. If we can't pass a massive climate bill, then it's on us as leaders at the local level and in the private sector to figure out how we're going to reduce greenhouse gases by 30-40% in the next 5 years. We got to figure that out whether or not the Democrats and Republicans can pass a climate infrastructure bill. So public-private partnership is going to be critical. And even if they do pass a climate infrastructure bill, in order to make sure the money is invested wisely, we need public-private partnerships to provide the feedback and the data on what's working, what's not, where more taxpayer dollars should be invested, because that's where we're building wealth and reducing greenhouse gases and improving health in our community. So I think public-private partnerships are central. And as an early Obama staffer and supporter, I was a senior staffer on his campaign, I believe that public-private partnerships should have played a greater role in the 2009 Economic Recovery Act and stimulus. I think we would have had some better outcomes in different parts of the country had we had public-private partnerships as a baseline. So.
I would add, you know, the thing that I've been fixated on as it relates to public-private partnerships, and I would include a broader definition of private or add another P in terms of philanthropic, is, you know, we have this American Rescue Plan that was passed, which is translating to about $10 billion of federal dollars coming into Metro Atlanta. And then we have this, prospectively, this infrastructure bill that hopefully will get, some version of will get passed sometime soon. And in that, to me, there's huge opportunity to really leverage it, kind of to the point Donnel was just making with respect to, go back to 2009 and some of what happened there in terms of, okay, there's definitely going to be not only an opportunity to leverage some of these unrestricted dollars, but also some very targeted dollars that focus on environmental sustainability, greening in some form or fashion. And so to me, how we start to link these together, the public and private and nonprofit communities, to think through, okay, if, for example, there is a bunch of retrofitting of buildings with our cold climate heat pump, for example, right? Who's going to do that? Who's going to install them? Where do the companies get used? Because the government isn't going to do that. They're going to have the money, they're going to procure it. But if we have folks we have good workforce development training programs that are working with companies, that are getting folks trained and to do that, and we have good DBE requirements in terms of who gets those contracts and how they get dispersed, then you start to see both how we start to really green, whether it's building or really leverage that, and also how it can potentially benefit both from a workforce perspective as well as a wealth perspective in these companies. To me, that's an immediate, very clear and tangible opportunity we have in Metro Atlanta. Really, this is going to happen across the country. I'm very focused on Metro Atlanta, how we can really try to leverage that for good for our communities and really in an equitable way.
Let me just add, because I know Chandra's going to close us out with a bang, but 10 seconds. I didn't know until I went home to visit my mom 2 weeks ago, the center of the national heat pump industry in America is in Georgia. Like Mitsubishi, the largest manufacturer of these heat pumps that trains all the workers and all the firms on how to make them and install them, they're like 20 minutes away outside the perimeter up 85. I had no idea. So I just wanted to add that to Frank's comment.
Thanks, Donnel. Chandra?
Absolutely, and I'm glad that public-private partnership for sure. Ditto, Frank, on that third P and making sure that is included potentially in that private. And I particularly this state to federal flow. The rescue plan, as we talked about, there's billions of dollars sitting right now in governments and municipalities who just don't know that down on page 32 of the Treasury guidance that you can use this money for weatherization, energy efficiency, utility assistance, rental assistance, all of these things they're sort of not used to. It's critical for us to start identifying what those capacity gaps are now. So when the infrastructure dollars do flow, whatever form they take, then our counties and local governments and the advocate, community is ready to help make sure those dollars are directed. I mean, this is a historic investment opportunity for improved financial stability, for the creation of these thriving wage job opportunities and entrepreneurship opportunities that we are talking about. And I think this is a good opportunity to mention Justice 40, as we are, talking about how we advance environmental justice and racial equity to create a regenerative economy. Again, has to be about focusing on those who are first and most impacted. We know that due to the history of structural racism and bureaucratic inadequacies that we're talking about at these within government, that these same communities lack access to the capacity and resources to implement the solutions that they are creatively building and creating on a super hyper local level. So Partnership for Southern Equity, Elevate Energy, Groundswell, and Hummingbird and the Solutions Project have come together to create this accelerator capacity building formation, if you will, to make sure that communities who are at the front lines of climate and environmental and social injustices they already have the solutions, right? But how do we make sure they have the capacity, access to the capacity and resources to help drive that systemic transformational change? So I think that's a great example of this sort of public-private partnership that we are talking about, because these new grantees that will be coming through the accelerators are exactly the people who are going to be going to their local governments and talking to the counties, all these different offices about how to partner on these projects to make sure they are meeting this moment to be able to finally invest in environmental justice infrastructure.
Thanks, Chandra. And I know that Justice 40 just extended the application for technical assistance and for also people who want to go through the accelerator. Southface is, excited to be part of that network as well. And I think it's just justice40.org. Is that right, Chandra?
I'll drop it in the chat.
Okay.
JusticePartyAccelerator.org.
So at this point, I think we're going to move over to some audience questions, and we'll end with sort of a call to action. So I'm going to give the panelists what my final question to you will be, so you can kind of think about it as we go through some of the audience questions. And we'll end with this. What single idea, solution, or thought gives you hope that we can achieve a regenerative future? So that's the question. And then I want to make sure everybody knows how they can get more involved with the work that you're doing. So make sure that you address those two. And I'll repeat it at the end as well, but I want to give you that heads up. Okay. So Chandra, the first question is to you. You mentioned your work is focused on addressing equity issues at the root cause. So in looking at issues that have created significant wealth gaps in the Black community, what steps do we need to take in order to address the racial wealth gap?
We need directed capital investment. We need dollars on the ground in community. We need directed dollars. We have to be able to have real conversation about reparations and what that means. Who would have imagined 5 years ago that let alone 10 years ago, that we would be in a place to really talk about what that means in a justice frame, particularly as it relates to capital. We have to make strong, directed, intentional shifts of moving capital into communities who can begin to generate capital for community wealth building in most distressed areas. And the way to do that is just more investment.
Thank you. The next one is to Donnel. There was a question on why we need to include data collection in new green infrastructure systems. And you answered it in the chat that all new tech will include data collection, and we should, quote unquote, own or control that data. But could you possibly expand on the value of what we can learn from that data? What does the data teach us? And what can we do with that data?
Well, I mean, Southface is a leader in the region about how to train, workforces on how to green buildings, how to make them more energy efficient and lower the amount of fossil fuel usage and waste. Now, the reason that's important is, I grew up in a low income household. You can end up paying 10, 20% of the total money coming into your household to your utility bill. I know utility bills in Georgia can be low, but across the country, or if you have 10, 15 people in a home who are sharing that space, utility bills can be quite high, particularly if some of those people not working, so they're home eating and showering and watching cable all day. Your utility bill can be sky high and eat up a significant part of your revenue. That's how I grew up. People are always home running up my mother's light bill. And so when we reduce this energy consumption, we can end up saving low-income people money in addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Now, in order to green a building, it's a renovation or an upgrade where you need skilled workers to perform an assessment of that building and understand the way that building uses energy now, how to recommend and replace, almost like a clean energy prescription or diagnosis that a doctor would make when you're ill. That's what we need to do to 127 million buildings across the country. And that requires a lot of training and skills. And Southface is, of course, the best in the business at doing that in the South. Now, when you have data that comes off of your buildings, that allows you to make a better assessment or a more accurate diagnosis of what kind of clean energy solutions are needed in an individual building in order to make an upgrade. And the reason this is so tricky is because you might have two buildings that are next to one another in Southwest Atlanta, and they were built by the same construction company, same blueprint, same material, built same year by the same work crew. And you put two different families in those buildings, and you come back to those buildings 30 years later when the kids have grown up and grown to college, and you say, well, we want to retrofit these buildings and make them green. And you'll put organic insulation in the attic of both buildings. And in the first building, you'll save that family 11% on their electricity bill. And in the second building, you'll trap carbon monoxide and kill everybody in the building. It's the same building. But the way that those families used and maintained those buildings over time changed the profile of those buildings, that the diagnosis of how to prescribe clean energy solutions in both of those buildings are different. So every building is a unique snowflake that has to be assessed by a trained assessor in order to make sure that the clean energy recommendations that we're making are appropriate and accurate. And data from all of the equipment in buildings allows us to reduce the cost and increase the accuracy of that assessment. So that's why the data from the equipment is so important. And so it's going to be a giant $1 trillion industry, and there's a question of who's going to control it. I think that with the people on this call, I mean, we could train minority and women-owned contractors in Atlanta to use data and new techniques to green buildings across Atlanta and go into communities of faith. We could sign a public-private partnership to get some money from the White House to finance some of it, and Frank could lend some of the company monies to buy equipment and buy trucks and get started. Those are the kinds of public-private partnerships that we can do to take advantages of these opportunities. So I'll stop there. I hope that answers.
Absolutely. Thank you. The next question is for all three of you. And I think it ties in really well to what you were just talking about, Donnel, in terms of the AEC community. How can the professionals who work within the development, construction, and architectural industry help advance equity within the companies and organizations that they work for? And if they aren't part of the top level leadership and part of the decision makers. So how can members or staff members of companies that are architectural, engineering, construction, how can they influence change within their own companies to build in equity if they're not at the top? And any one of you can start.
We are talking about grassroots organizing. That is exactly what grassroots organizing is about, about people power and shifting that very oppressive hierarchy. All movements, all social movements have started with an uprising of people. And you can do that in your architecture firm, you can do that in your company, and it seems hard. Well, you know what? Change is hard, and organizing and mobilizing is hard. You would be hard pressed these days to not find a resource at a company where someone isn't talking about, diversity or inclusion or equity, but we have to go outside of this sort of corporate DEI now and really get to where are the anti-racism resources? How do we build an anti-racist organization? And there are multiple resources out there for that. Southface was always good about this. Like, as you're talking to somebody and saying, well, hey, let's meet up and have a conversation about it, and 2 people might come, and then maybe 4 other people come next week, and you call a meeting, right? I mean, that's what we do in organizing. You get some people together and you host a meeting, and then you host another meeting, and then you host another meeting, and you keep talking about it. So I think that's definitely the place to start, is just to start.
I would just add to that, in terms of, for folks just within the context of their jobs, I think so much of companies' inability or unwillingness or just lack of success in working with whether it's minority contractors in a particular context is access to information and just networks. Because you kind of, human nature is you work with what you know, and then if you're a majority-owned company, they just don't have those networks. So to the degree to which you are able to help make connections and educate and introduce to different contractors and to push them, because I think they're, to the point I think Chandra was just raising, we're in a moment now where they're more open to it than they say were a year and a half ago, 2 years ago. Making those connections and to those networks and individual companies and contractors, I think is a very tangible, discrete thing that I think anyone can do to the degree you have those connections. And if not, as was alluded to, I think Southface can help in that regard as well.
Donnel, anything to add to that? It's okay if you say
I'd love to see, I'd love to see as part of the requirements for state or federal or city funding that there be some diversity in the C-suite. Goldman Sachs and the state of California are now requiring companies that go public to have, I believe, 2 women at least on the board of directors. So I think we just got to get firmer about, well, if you want to work with tax dollars or you want to work with certain leading private sector entities, diversity is just a baseline requirement. It's got to be like, well, you don't have insurance, you can't do this contract. Well, you don't have any diversity, so why would we hire you? If we hire you, you don't have any diversity, you're at risk of screwing up this contract because you don't have the diversity of thought and experience that's necessary to ensure outperformance. And so we can't hire you to work on this project. So I like to see stuff like that to work in partnership with people who are making changes from inside their organizations.
Great, very well said. And I think that diversity of thought, of experience, of age, of culture, of race, of ethnicity, of sexual orientation, all of those experiences brings together different points of view that will only result in better results, right? That collective and the collection of those experiences. And that's a really important part of moving this forward. All right, I think we have time for one more question, and then I'm going to go to the final question. Let's see. I'm trying to find a good one. So we've talked a lot about jobs. And we've talked a lot about the green economy and the expansion of the green economy. Our experience at Southface, I know experiences with other organizations, are how do you reach out? How do you recruit inside communities of color? How do you let people know that these are jobs that are worth having, that the opportunities exist? And I know, that's been a challenge in the past, and I think the opportunity is now, and the time is now, in order to make this movement, this workforce movement to the green economy, a functional, equitable way. So what are some ideas that the three of you have of how do we reach into these communities of color, these vulnerable and disenfranchised communities, to show that there are green job possibilities?
I would just start because it's pretty much, in my experience, been true, whether you're talking about green jobs or talking about vaccines and getting folks to be open to taking vaccines. You've got to work with folks in places that people trust. And so you have to work with folks who already have trusting relationships with the folks you're trying to, whether you share information with or share opportunity with. That's where it starts, because they know where folks get information, and more importantly, they trust that information. And so from my perspective, that's the key thing, is depending on who you're trying to target, is working and identifying trusted agents and groups within the respective communities and partnering with them to do that in a good and equitable way.
Yeah, ditto. Frank said it. This is relationships, right? Sometimes we jump immediately to the thing instead of remembering what connects people in the first place, and that is relationships. That's building a level of trust, and you've got to have those trusted messengers. As Frank spoke about, those partners. See people, see people who in your church, who in your organization, who at your bank, on your kids' softball team are you working with that may be engaged with another organization who is made up of the kind of people that you want to reach. Have you ever gone to an NAACP meeting? Have you ever visited the Black church down the street from your white church, the most segregated still institution in America? You know, you just have to do the work. You know, there's no shortcut, you know, to that. And it has to start from trust-based relationships. So then you're even at a point to talk to someone about what you might have to offer.
It's all about relationships at the end of the day. Donnel, anything to add to this?
Look, I grew up, like I said, like in a low income family. We were in Brooklyn, then we moved out to Southeast Atlanta and then out to Stone Mountain in Atlanta. And the whole time we were broke, we didn't have any money. And energy was an issue because we couldn't afford to make the payments. Oftentimes we couldn't even afford to eat. You know, we would go to Taco Bell and eat bean burritos for 30 cents because that's what we could afford. Bean burritos are terrible. And particularly when you're a kid. And so I think that energy and all of the health problems that are caused in low-income communities by the lack of access to healthy, smart, efficient equipment, I don't think that low-income communities are going to be like late to the party on clean energy. I think from what we see in our business, low-income communities, they're proud to get some solar panels up on their home. They have seen President Obama, who they love universally and trust and respect. They've seen him advocate for solar policy, and they want clean energy and solar and all of these energy efficiency technologies in their home. And they darn sure want the jobs and the middle class income that come along with a lot of this work. So to me, the question is, how can we have low-income communities lead and be the earliest adopters in America for energy efficiency and clean energy on their homes and for their clean energy jobs? I'm on the board of Sierra Club, and they'll oftentimes be like, well, how do we get more minorities to join the Sierra Club? Well, we don't want to join the Sierra Club because it's racist, but we do want clean energy in our communities more so than people in Sierra Club. We might not care about going on some hike on the Chattahoochee River, which I did for the first time ever. Even though I grew up in Atlanta, I never went to the Chattahoochee, never went jogging or any of that stuff till I'm age 40, which I am today. So there's this tension between environmentalism and energy efficiency and clean energy. Low-income communities, we might not be out front in the Sierra Club to go hiking on the Chattahoochee, but we will be out front to get clean energy jobs and install solar panels in our community. And so the question is, what do we need to do to make the investments to unlock that leadership from our low-income communities and communities of color? Because we want to lead this movement. We are able to lead this movement. We're the most qualified, and that's how it should be set up. And so we need to help our policymakers in DC or in the state government understand that low-income communities are not like some afterthought, but we actually need to lead this movement. And then we as low-income communities need to step up and train our people to have the skills that are necessary so that we can actually follow through and exert that leadership over this industry. And the last thing I'd add, again, just to put another point on it, this heat pump industry will be a $100 billion industry in America, and it is headquartered in Atlanta. And so just like how you think of Detroit and it's the home of the auto industry in America, like heat pumps, like that is Atlanta. And so there's a challenge to all of us as people who are from Atlanta and love Atlanta. What are we gonna do to make sure there is an economic boom coming to the city because of this industry that the Biden team is gonna invest billions of dollars in? What are we gonna do to make sure that our communities benefit from that boom and own some of that boom? Don't tell people I said Sierra Club is racist. Okay, thank you. They're racist though. Don't tell people.
All right. First, I want to thank all of our panelists. You guys have done an amazing job. I love seeing the chat blow up. But we're all about solutions here. So I'm going to leave you all with the great words of Chandra, Frank, and Donnel with the one question. What single idea, solution, or thought gives you the hope that we can achieve a regenerative future? And then how can people learn more about the work that you're doing? So Chandra, we'll start with you.
My hope lies in my people. You know, my hope lies in people who are willing to keep standing up every day under impossible circumstances, under ever oppressive and increasing oppressive structures where our rights are constantly being threatened at all levels of government, but continue to stand up, come to these conversations, learn together, and build power together. And as a way to get involved and talk about those things, I invite everyone always to attend our Just Energy Circle meetings. They are every third Friday from 10 a.m. to 12 p.m., where we talk about lots of the things that we talk about today, but it is shared space to build community and build power. So we feel good about attacking these issues together.
Thank you, Chandra. Frank?
Well, besides Donnell's heat pump, which does give me hope, and especially given that it's focused here in Georgia, you know, I'll go kind of where I started with, which was talking about Cook Park and just the green infrastructure and just how it's been more and more embraced, and kind of the shift from gray to green infrastructure. Again, it's not like, you know, it's not as inspiring, but it's a very tangible thing that gives me hope that we're bit by bit moving in the right direction.
Thank you. Donnel?
Yeah, I like the fact, I like a lot of the stuff that we talked about. I like the fact that Mitsubishi up the street from you guys in Atlanta doesn't have enough skilled workers to install their equipment. I think that's a major opportunity for women and people of color to build up and own this new industry. And that makes me hopeful. And, you know, in the conversations I'm in, whether it's, you know, in the board meeting at Sierra Club or with the Biden-Harris team, or with the head of Microsoft, or I don't talk to the head of Microsoft, but people at Microsoft or people at Apple, there's a lot of tech companies, leadership in the government, leadership in the private sector, and of course, leadership in our citizenship sector who want to address climate change and want to address historical disparities and racial equality. And so you could talk to leaders at Google or in the government or down in Atlanta, and everybody's saying, how can we respond to George Floyd and the climate crisis? What kind of response is going to deliver environmental justice and economic justice? And I just love the fact that so many of us are thinking about it and collaborating to work together on it. I think people like Chandra are really going to lead the way in all of this work nationally and continue to lead. And that gives me a lot of hopeful. Every time I see Chandra Farley, that gives me hope. And so I am very hopeful about the opportunity we all have to build new industries together. If they could do it for Uber and Facebook, certainly we can do it for industries that are going to save our planet and put wealth in the pockets of our community. So.
Thank you all so much. And I'm turning over to Catherine for closing remarks. Thanks.
Great. Sorry, I was trying to find my mute button. Well, thanks so much, everyone, for joining us. That was an amazing conversation. Thank you so much to Donnel, Chandra, Frank, and Andrea for sharing your experience and wisdom. Like Andrea said, it was amazing to see how you guys were responding in the chat box. Thanks so much for engaging. We have an event-packed fall with some events returning even in person. So go check out our website, www.southface.org for future events, info on our impact, and to find online trainings on our learning platform. We hope to see you soon. Bye.